The last topic, this came up. I had thought about it in a couple of different ways, and then last week, one of you said to me, we were talking. I don't even know how it came up, but we were talking about words we use, and you said, "I know I've really dropped saying sorry, and I'm much better now at saying thank you. So instead of saying sorry I was late, you say thank you so much for waiting for me." And it reminded me of the four agreements, which I will talk to you about it in a moment. But the first agreement of the four agreements is to be impeccable with your words. And here is a fun little example from Danny Donovan, where this, I think it was like emails that you write. And so what she says here is exactly that, right? Instead of saying, when you've taken a while to get something done, but you know the person can wait, instead of saying sorry for the delay, say thanks for your patience, right? My schedule matters too. Instead of saying to someone what works best for you, say, could you do, 3 o'clock on Wednesday? If not, what else, please offer something else, right? So as opposed to minimizing yourself, make sure that the words that you use matter in terms of the image that you're trying to convey. And I put this off the back of the discussion we were just having with respect to being a senior manager. I want to tell you a story about words that happened a couple of years ago. I had moved to a division, a completely new job. The only person I knew in that division was the head of the business. And it was a 100-person global organization. The headquarters business had 50 people in it, and then the rest were spread out. And so I was based in the headquarter business. After a couple months there, I noticed in meetings that people had this verbal habit that they would say, kind of, right? So they would say, well, I was talking to the investor and he kind of said that they could put in, maybe kind of 300 million, but he kind of needs to make sure that we can get the GPLP structure right because it kind of has this regulatory issue. And so I started noticing this more and more, that it was quiet and subtle. It wasn't when you see someone presenting and they say, it was just like really worked into the way they would speak. But it was everyone from the partners all the way down to the analysts in the organization. They all did it. And so I went to the head of the group and I said, what is that? And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't noticed it. And I said, okay, I can barely concentrate. It's just, now he had been there a year and a half at that point. And I said, I can barely concentrate. It's just everywhere. And he finally, a day later, came back to me and said, oh my gosh, you're right. I hear it. Now, long story short, everyone did it. It was so pervasive. What we finally ended up doing was we created a kind of a swear jar. And we would bring this jar to meetings. We kept it in our conference room. And if a partner said kind of, they had to put $5 into the jar. And if anyone else did, they had to put $1 into the jar. And we were going to throw a party with it. I can't even tell you how much money that we raised from having this kind of a swear jar. But what I realized is that I looked later around the organization to try to figure out where this had come from. And what I found out is it was in response to the leadership style of the person at the top of the organization. Because that person at the top of the organization had set a culture of, you can't ever be wrong. You can't ever say, I don't know, let me go find out the answer. You needed to know everything. And if you had said a client's going to give you 300 million and then they didn't, you were going to get in trouble. So what happened was that everybody started softening. They started hedging what they were saying. Well, he kind of said he could give us 300 million, and he kind of, has a regulatory issue. Don't tell regulators that you kind of have a regulatory issue. You either do or you don't. And so I realized it was a cultural thing. But by bringing this to their attention and pointing it out, what happened was that everyone started being much more mindful of everything they were saying. So not just the fact that they were putting these verbal qualifiers in, but they were being so much more thoughtful because they would stop and think before they spoke in terms of what they wanted to say. Our meetings were much more productive. We started accomplishing so much more in less time because people weren't just like talking to talk. They were really specifically trying to say, okay, I met with the client and they're in for $300 million if we can resolve this regulatory issue. Nice and simple. So that was my story with respect to the words that we use, and understanding that very often the words that you use, particularly when it's those qualifiers, are demonstrating something else. So they're demonstrating something cultural, or they're demonstrating something you think about yourself internally. And that's why it's so important to make sure that you get the words right. Along those lines, then, it made me remember the 4 agreements. So again, in the mid-90s, I said we were going throwback to the 90s and all of this. Don Miguel Ruiz wrote a book called The 4 Agreements. He and his son have actually updated it to a book called The Fifth Agreement. So I'll tell you what the 5th agreement is, because it's not on the slide, but I have read it. And the first agreement is to be impeccable with your word. And they say that impeccable, the Latin root of impeccable, is without sin. And so when he talks about it from Toltec wisdom, this is a wisdom tradition, Mexican wisdom tradition, that words have power. Words can liberate or control. They can be positive. They can be negative. They can shape ideas, or they can kill spirit. Right? You've seen it. You've tapped into you, and you've done it before. Right? You've done it when you've used words to lift someone, or when you've maybe used them to check them. Right? So we know we can do this. We know how powerful words are. The first agreement with respect to Toltec is very much about yourself, and speaking with integrity and accuracy. It builds trust with others and demonstrates competency and increases alignment with your ambition, because the more you have your words lined up with where you're going, the more people will understand what you stand for. But in this tradition, they're very much focused on you and the way you speak to yourself. So I've expanded it to be much more career oriented. So it's much more about how you interface with others. But in the original tradition, it's very much about the way you talk to yourself. And I know we've done some of that in earlier modules. But I thought about this last week when it came up multiple times, just thinking about the words that we use. And as we're crafting our master plan and we're working on our ambition statement, really think about the words that you use. Really think about, when you use the word family, what does family mean to you? When you use the word thought leader, what is thought leader or innovator, or any of the words that were in some of the earlier slides? What do these words really mean to you, in order to make sure that you have a supporting framework to be able to live up to them? Don't choose your words lightly, right? Choose your words very thoroughly and with good mindfulness and with good care and forethought. So that was why I wanted to put the 4 agreements in, particularly the first agreement. But I also, in remembering them, I do remember that the other agreements are actually things that we've actually covered, but it's a good reminder to have it all rolled in together. The second agreement, take nothing personally. I'm guessing you know this by now, but the more your stronger sense of self that you have, the less that you rely on external validation, right? And then you're able to build your own confidence. When you can neutralize negative influences if you don't take things personally. So anytime someone says something that you could consider as a slight or an attack, if you really don't take it personally, then you're much more empowered to be able to move past it. So that's the second agreement. Don't take anything personally. The third agreement, don't make assumptions. I think this is particularly relevant right now with everything going on in the world in terms of talking about racism and inequality. Don't make assumptions. Don't make assumptions about individuals in the workplace, or individuals in terms of where they come from. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you a quick story. This week, I had a meeting with the head of diversity at a very large global private equity firm. And I thought that they were going to see things the way I did. Particularly given their cultural profile. So I thought, hey, wait a minute, I get it, so you must get it as well. And I was wrong. I was actually wrong. And it ended up being a conversation where we were speaking at cross purposes, because I was just pushing her to a certain place that she was just not comfortable with. She thought I was really saying, I don't think you're doing enough. Is the organization not supporting you enough? And she was saying, I think this is enough. So it was really interesting that I had made the conscious effort to make an assumption about someone, and I was completely wrong. So it wasn't something that I had done on autopilot. I had consciously said, I bet because of her profile and the role that she has in the organization, she's going to understand exactly what I'm trying to say and how I feel about it. And she just didn't. So it was a good recent lesson learned for me. The answer to this one, may ask as many questions as you need to get clarity on every single situation. So I fell into my own trap on that one, right? There was a lot more questions I could have asked before I assumed and came out of the gate like arm in arm with her saying, we think, and she said, no, I don't think that. You have to explain it to me better. So real good reminder there for me. The fourth agreement, always do your best. I mean, this is not the one that we have to work very hard at, is it? Because all of us are always trying to do our best. But what it is trying to say is remember self-compassion, remember kindness, and remember to do your best on all three of these things, the other first three agreements. So do your best with being impeccable with your words. You're not going to be perfect with it. You may say the wrong thing. You may, shut off your front brain and use your mid brain to respond to someone sometimes. That's okay, but don't beat yourself up about it. Be understanding that you're human and that sometimes we're going to try to do our best, but we're not always going to be perfect. So that's really what the fourth agreement says. The fourth agreement is saying, do your best in terms of trying to be impeccable with your word and taking nothing personally, and don't make assumptions. Try to live a full life. Try to live up to your full potential. But when you don't, in the moments that you don't, please address yourself with self-compassion and with kindness. The fifth agreement, which they introduced later and is not, I can't remember the year that book came out, but maybe 10 years later. And now Don Miguel and his son, I apologize, I can't remember. I think it's maybe Don Juan, but he's also a Don Ruiz. He and his son actually roadshow now. Like they were at one of my meditation centers where they actually talk about the agreements. So he's transferring this over to his son now. And so when they release the fifth agreement is to be skeptical. And particularly when it comes to all of these. So to be skeptical about the world, to constantly be inquisitive and to be questioning. And so they introduced the fifth agreement, which supports the first four in terms of how you're living your life and in the tradition of the four agreements.